80% of care in the home is provided by a family caregiver. The system falls apart without the involvement of family members. And so I think we are still in the early learning and acceptance by health plans and health systems and providers that this is a key stakeholder, that is not a nice to have. This is not the fluffy stuff that feels good about healthcare. It is truly the delivery of care. And until we address wholeheartedly and holistically what challenges family caregivers, we're further putting patients at risk. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. The company itself was born out of that personal experience from our founders, and so we're on the quest of how do we help healthcare organizations recognize the issue, create a solution and a support, and implement that in a way that actually draws out that workforce and makes them feel a part of what's happening to them and for their loved ones.
How's your heart going today? What's going on?
My heart's going pretty good today. I just had a really lovely weekend in what is warmer California with family, and I'm riding that wave into the week.
I love that. Well, one of the things I think would be an amazing conversation for us to kind of dive in here today on the podcast is a little bit about what the current state of healthcare is, but also how we are thinking about how technology kind of plays in a space that has been, to say it lightly, a little bit slow to adopt new pieces of technology and innovation. In our previous conversation, I talked about how my big aha moment was when I started my first company, our telehealth company, back in 2014. And I was trying to innovate in that space, and I was like, the writing's on the wall. This is what we need to do. Video is going to be a thing, and nobody believed me. Mm-hmm. But I know that you have a history, right, in healthcare technology. So how have you kind of seen the years unfold that we're currently in, where technology, EMRs, AI, all this different type of stuff is coming together to be able to kind of enable patients to be a little bit more impactful? Hey, yeah. Kitty, what's going on?
Surprise guest on this. She's got an opinion, apparently. And I hate to be that crazy cat lady, but you just can't control what
of course
happens. So yeah, slow is a good descriptor. I think we talked about it last time. This notion that being early sometimes feels a lot like being wrong. And I had a similar experience early on. This is like the late 90s, early 2000s, and had this idea about bringing a curriculum to physicians that had been previously on Scantron. And we thought, oh, well, why don't we just put this on the internet? People will love it. And in an industry that is still using fax machines 25 years later, being early often felt like being wrong in that case too. I would say, the ambition is always faster than the reality. And I'm really heartened by really interesting applications of AI and those kinds of technologies that can make teams more efficient, can make the delivery of care, ironically, more human. I think ambient listening in clinical settings is really interesting and helpful in sort of helping the providers focus on the patient rather than their documentation. I mean, I think there are lots of great applications, but we live in a highly regulated, appropriately, I think, regulated industry. And so sometimes our ability to adopt them is just so much slower. It's so much slower for healthcare organizations, not just to adopt, but, they have really Byzantine contracting systems and processes and things that just they can be really difficult. And so I think it takes a lot of fortitude and flexibility from service providers and innovators, and it takes finding the top 5% of organizations that, not necessarily the top, the top in the industry, but those that are good at innovating and have the strength of culture to try new things and to experiment where there's good reason to, but they have to move out on the tiniest of limbs. I think you got to find those diamonds in the rough, I guess.
I mean, there's a saying that I like to repeat with my team, which is like, change the incentives, change the outcomes, right? And forever, there's always been a lack of incentives to be a little bit more consumer centric in healthcare. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we're kind of at, where, I mean, especially because of the pandemic, right? People were introduced to a brand new type of, I would say, consumer-centric, accessible healthcare system, being able to kind of use tools like asynchronous chat, being able to hop into an EMR, a patient portal, using telehealth, things like that. Do you think that was a catalyst for, I would say, the future generations of what healthcare providers and healthcare consumers expect when it comes to how technology is going to be kind of, configured to meet them where they're at with easier, more accessible ways?
I think you're right. Well, I certainly wholeheartedly think you're right about you change the incentives, you change the actions. I mean, I think in my business, focusing on the family caregiver and realizing that there is never a time that somebody says to me, we don't need family caregivers, or this isn't important, or none of that, right? We're in the business of mom and apple pie. But providers who would say, yes, I see caregivers in my practice and I know they need help, don't really have a way of helping them until now CMS creates a billing code and they can bill for that service. And now you start to see, okay, we can adopt it. So I think, it's a really like present example of what you're describing. I think that the adoption of technology and think, just like there was no use for QR codes until you wanted to order something at a restaurant after the pandemic. I think particularly telehealth and virtual visits, everyone agreed was a good idea. We sort of tinkered around with like, can it be billed for in the same way that a real, an in-person visit would. I think that sort of broke open a bit of a seal. And I think we have further to go. I don't think, I think that you could, everything about my healthcare provider has seen more of me in reality and in documentation. And yet every time I go to them, it's like I'm a whole new human, right? Netflix knows everything about me and everything I like and everything I don't like. And so I think there's still some distance to go on that consumer experience. And I think we've got very limited channels, right? Everything has to go through mostly Epic in that consumer experience. So miles to go before we sleep. But I think you're right that there's more receptivity and more innovation happening in the last 5 to 7 years than in the last 15. Part of that, I think, is a funding issue, but yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, when you've got this is kind of what we had to navigate back in 2014 when we started the telehealth company. It was like, okay, but like, how do we bill for it? Mm-hmm. Right. And there was a code, I think it was G3014, which was an originating site facilitation fee. And so for hosting the telehealth interaction, you had the ability to bill for that. And that was a mechanism that got people to kind of think about those things, which was really interesting. But that's what drove the most adoption for us, which was, how do we bill for it? And there has to be a mechanism that allows for people to do that. So I want to do something really quick, which is going to be, I want to pull up your website. So the Carallel website says caregivers are a hidden force. Now, let's talk a little bit about Carallel, what the inspiration behind the brand and the organization is in itself, but also, what does this mean? Caregivers are a hidden force.
Yeah, absolutely. So something north of 1 in 5 adults are serving as a family caregiver. They might not identify with the term. They might not describe themselves with that phrase. So we do have a language limitation, but they're the backbone of the healthcare industry. They are the backbone of healthcare delivery. The issue and the reason that the mission that we're on is to recognize that they are navigating an increasingly fragmented system that is largely unfriendly to them, that puts all sorts of obstacles in the way of their involvement, pays really no attention to their ability to perform the responsibilities that they've taken on usually out of love and care. But it's a job that we describe as everything from the janitor to the CEO of a family, and they're untrained, unpaid, and didn't apply for the job. And so the idea for Carallel is to recognize what makes caregiving hard, address those foundational causes so that caregivers can be more resilient, feel more confident, feel supported, and more capable of caring for their loved ones. And the hidden workforce headline is really about acknowledging that this isn't about, sure, it is the right thing to do. But more importantly, 80% of care in the home is provided by a family caregiver. The system falls apart without the involvement of family members. And so I think we are still in the early learning and acceptance by health plans and health systems and providers that this is a key stakeholder that is not a nice to have. This is not the fluffy stuff that feels good about healthcare. It is truly the delivery of care. And until we address wholeheartedly and holistically what challenges family caregivers, we're further putting patients at risk. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. The company itself was born out of that personal experience from our founders, and so we're on the quest of how do we help healthcare organizations recognize the issue, create a solution and a support, and implement that in a way that actually draws out that workforce and makes them feel a part of what's happening to them and for their loved ones.
My first experience about recognizing how important the family caregiver was when I was 18 years old, and my father got a call on a random Tuesday, and it was the doctor at the hospital in Washington State. We lived in Detroit at the time. And he said, "Hey, listen, your mom is about to go on hospice, right? You need to make sure that all of her, belongings are together and make sure everything's in line because she's going to be transitioning here pretty quickly." So what does my dad do at the age of 43 years old? He drops everything, flies across the country, is there at the bedside with his mom, but he had no medical background. He had no understanding about the complexities of what an interdisciplinary hospice team was going to look like. He didn't know what the transition expectations were. He also didn't know how to communicate these things to his family. Mm-hmm. And so for the first time, he found himself in an unfamiliar position, which was he was the coordinator, he was the caregiver, he was the communicator on the family's behalf, and he was also the person who was curating what the end of her life was going to look like, and had no previous experience before that Tuesday. And I think about how we even have statistics where 10,000 people a day are turning 65 years and older, right? So we need to start enabling people with the tools and the resources and the technology so they can be the best version of themselves as they go through the inevitably scary experience. And that's why I love what you guys are doing. It's so important.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for sharing the story. I mean, I think that the one thing you left out about your dad in that situation is he's also the son who's having to face the emotion of this is happening to his mother. And I think, the reality that we have to try to get people to wake up to is it's not just about how do we explain to your dad and train him on what all these things mean, but also tend to his well-being, because the emotional part makes all of those logistics harder, and all of those logistics make all the emotions more fraught. And it is, in some ways, we are starting to recognize, this idea that we've introduced billing codes is an acknowledgement that that caregivers are taking responsibilities, but all of it is focused on how do we train them, not how do we enable them. And so I think that is a key part of it. The other thing that somebody said, that I can't take credit for this, but somebody said it to me a couple of weeks ago at a conference. We've been talking for a long time about the baby boomers. Now all of the baby boomers are 65. We've been talking a long time about people, 10,000 people a day aging into Medicare. Well, we're getting to the point where 10,000 people are not turning 65, but 10,000 people are turning 85. And that is a whole different set of circumstance on who is supporting that wave. So we do a lot of work, particularly in Medicare and with Medicare Advantage plans. And when you're turning 65, or you're in that 65 to 72-ish range, you're probably caregiving for a parent who's still with you, or for a spouse. And so you're sort of in your dad's seat of like, how do I navigate this? And what is it doing to my own wellness? But then, cast it forward in 20 years and you're in that 85 plus range. And now you're dependent on a caregiver, and that's that there's a whole lifespan in Medicare that happens that really has a special relationship on both sides of that coin on how caregiving impacts them. So I think I'm just gonna have a long-winded agreement with you again.
If the Hart Hustle Podcast has ever sparked any idea or made you think differently, do us a favor. Make sure to guys share this, post it on LinkedIn, or even text that nonprofit friend that you just have. Whatever works, this is what keeps the conversation going and allows us to just grow this community together. Seriously, we appreciate you.
So when we think about technology, right? Naturally, it's very easy for our brain to go to the place of, well, if we just keep inventing different pieces of technology, we're going to completely lose the human element of care, right? So how do you guys think about using technology, not as a replacement, but as an enabler, right, to create a better sense of human connection? Because I think that's an important conversation we should double tap on as well.
Yeah, I love that conversation, because there's, particularly in our line of work, there's nothing more human than being a caregiver. And so I think we have to acknowledge the humanity, the emotion of it all. I think the beauty of technology is, it can be a really good connector. You talk about your dad as like the curator of information and communication back to the rest of the family. The enablement of that is so much more streamlined, and you can access information. You can do some really amazing things, but you also have to know what to do. And there is so much time and learning and learning curve of how to navigate caregiving challenges. So, we got to figure out how to pack up all of our stuff, or somebody's getting discharged and they can't be discharged home. So they've got to get into a nursing facility, and what are the right requirements? And you're dropping somebody into high stakes situations that they're totally unfamiliar with. And sure, you can search and read a bunch of reviews and do the kind of research that is appropriate for the importance of the decision, but you don't have a lot of time and you're not that familiar typically. And so yes, tools are helpful, but it's also really important. And what we've found with caregivers is we can save them a lot of time when you put an expert in their pocket who they can explain their situation to and explain who their mom is and what's important to her, and the cultural considerations that you're dealing with and the financial considerations that you're dealing with. And candidly, 20 to 30+% of our cases are with people that start with the some version of, I don't know what my question is, I just know I'm at the end of my rope. And so we have to acknowledge that that's sort of the state of caregiving right now, is that most of the time people feel unfamiliar and lack confidence. And that's a place where I think we don't want to replace that moment with technology. We want to sort of virtually wrap them in bubble wrap or give them a hug to say, it's going to be okay. Let's sort of break it down and let's come up with some steps that are going to help you in your situation. Then we may be handing you back to technology to manage some of that as the challenges have de-escalated. The other thing that I think is really important about application of technology and blending with a human relationship is allowing the humans to focus on the humanity. So, we talked earlier about ambient listening in the clinical settings. The beauty of that, I mean, one, it's so accurate and helpful from a job satisfaction for the provider's perspective. But also it allows the provider to turn from having this conversation with you to having this conversation with you. And it reinforces the humanity. And so, a lot of the work that we're doing is around how do we take documentation or reduce the documentation load for our team so they can focus on the conversation that they're having? How do we take the resources and recommendations that are appropriate for each individual conversation that they're having and insert it into their workflow without them having to search, right? These are all like little AI applications or automation workflows that can reduce the back end work for us, a care advocate, for a human, so that they can focus on the relationship. And out of the relationship comes so much learning and trust and sharing. And then on top of it, caregiving is really isolating. People retreat into, retreat may not be the right word. Retreat might be glossing over what, people get overwhelmed and cut off from their community, their personal community. And so it's really important to create human connection for caregivers, whether that's with our team, whether that's with a support group, whether that's, really giving them respite so that they can go out and tend to themselves. I also heard this from somebody else, but have stolen it relentlessly, which is technology can't give you a hug. And healthcare is an inherently human business that is built on, effective solutions, and really outcomes-driven solutions have some sort of understanding of that human element. So I think that we can't understate it, and I think that we can't hide behind the technology. And so, we've really prioritized, you call our team picks up. It's not, we're not going to have a bot or a phone tree before you can talk to a human, because, the I'm at the end of my rope person really doesn't need that in their life.
I think about where we came from. So back in the day, right, I always used to hear stories about what the doctor in the community represented. It was somebody who knew everything about your family, knew everything about you, Cindy, everything about you, Johnny. You're playing in the basketball game this weekend. I saw your aunt earlier today, like XYZ. Yeah. Everything was relationship based then. Then to go back to my earlier statement, right, we changed the incentives, we changed the outcomes. We started thinking about how much, I would say, productivity and billable CPT codes we could push through a system. So your doctors eventually went from being here with you to being here with you, right? Now we see technology. My girlfriend actually is a physician's assistant in an ortho clinic, and they have an ambient listening documentation system that she literally says, Keenan, I come home or I'm in the office, I hit the go button, I put it in my pocket, I'm able to be here the entire time to build a better relationship, right? And it's just interesting how we're seeing that technology is being an enabler to bring us back towards the human component of healthcare, because it's a people-to-people business at the end of the day. And I think people are yearning for that more so than ever, which is so cool. But I didn't really expect it to happen as quickly as it really did, with AI.
I think that's the real flip. I think that I have no data behind this except observation, is that I do think that it has shifted to at least on the front end of care delivery, it has shifted to a replacement strategy into an enablement strategy, and I think that's more, not only more effective, but more fulfilling for everybody. I don't think I would venture to guess, never having met your girlfriend, that she likes it better to just do this.
She's incredibly empathetic, right? And she's all about relationships. We're actually watching a show right now for everybody who's tuning in, watching, and listening today. There's a show on HBO right now, HBO Max, called The Pit. Have you heard of it?
I have, but I'm squeamish, so I'm scared to watch it.
So there's nothing like really gory in there, but it's just a documentation and like kind of like a chronological timeline, right, of like a 12-hour shift inside of the ER, which is really interesting. And one of these doctors gets a little bit of a stern talking to because they call her Slow-Mo. And they're like, well, why do you have the name Slow-Mo? Because you take too much time with these patients, right? Because we are getting pressed through administrators, through executives to be able to kind of push more people through the system. And she was like, yeah, how am I supposed to understand what their true needs are if I don't have the ability to establish a relationship with them? And it seems like the younger generation, right, of leaders and doctors and people who are coming into the space want to feel that human connection, because so much of our personal lives takes us away from all of those things. And it's like we have the ability to zig when everybody else is zagging back towards the human element, which I think is just, a reemergence of just the connection that we're all yearning for, especially in healthcare,
Yeah, totally. It's so many physicians that you talk to, you ask them, or healthcare professionals generally, why did you get into this? And it's always, more often than not, some story of somebody in their family went through something, or it was just sort of a fabric of their life, and how their family, a family of doctors, and this is what we talked about around the kitchen table. So I think it's spot on and encouraging, right? It's heartening because we've gone through real sort of the private equitization of healthcare, and massive mergers, and how do we just squeeze all of the efficiency out of it. Now that I say that, but I recognize that hospitals and health systems are low margin businesses that are really, they have to do that, right? Like I'm totally empathetic to the struggle of how you deliver care, and particularly, in the very present moment where funding sources feel very tenuous. It is a hard place to be in, to say, we want to slow everything down, because that's not how the incentives work. I do think that highly encouraged by the ongoing tuning around value-based care performance and investment there. We haven't cracked it yet, but that starts to shift how do we find the low acuity or low intensity experiences that can really promote better health. That's a good incentive alignment, for sure.
Yeah, I'm really interested to kind of see what the future of, value-based care, getting a little bit more into like a proactive mindset of healthcare rather than reactive. We are in layman's terms, just like data machines. We put out so much data every single day through when we wake up, we hop onto our device, data's flowing through that thing. We're consuming data, we're putting out data, our Apple Watches, everything else that we're wearing. Even my bed tracks like my heart rate at nighttime and things like that, which is interesting. And I just think that we're going to get to a place with the enablement of AI, right, that actually helps us be a little bit more proactive in managing our own health.
Yeah. Yeah. And what would be, so interesting, and this is, we're starting to see this creep up, is how you create interconnectivity between those data sources. So we're so used to looking at, well, what's the clinical data and the health data, and what is that telling us? But if we could start to connect what financial decision-making looks like as an early predictor of cognitive decline, then you start, what are the spending trends? Now, I started talking about how things are highly regulated and we have to be careful about where the data goes. But you're right that there's real power in that, and people smarter than me know how to like create these connections between different data sources. But tapping into that, I think you can get you could go terribly wrong from an ethics perspective. But done right, let's stay on the positive and the optimistic. You could get really proactive about early intervention, and not only is that lower cost, but better quality of life and lower intensity of interaction with the healthcare system at all. So those kinds of innovations, I think, are the most exciting.
I recently hosted on a separate podcast with my buddy Dante. We have an all podcast called All Innovation, and we were talking to the creator of the all-in-one camera phone solution, a guy named Philippe Kahn. Right, this guy is obviously very wealthy these days because one of his devices is in every one of our pockets, and he has a company now that has partnered with Tempur-Pedic, where they're using their AI strategy to be able to, I would say, understand macro data sets of sleep patterns. And he said, one of the things that we're looking at doing is we've had people who have had heart attacks, strokes, and even passed away while their data is actually being, curated and gathered from these systems. So something that we're looking at being able to do is, just like you said, is what data patterns can we see that might have happened 6-8 months ago in our HRV, so our heart rate variability, our breath rate at nighttime, the amount of sleep that we're getting. Are we actually getting into those lower levels of sleep and deep sleep that help us actually recharge and, heal the body? And so it's just really interesting to think about how people are thinking about all this data and how we can be more proactive, because it would be amazing to know that, like, hey, over the last 6 months, we've seen a couple patterns in your sleep history that you might need to be a little bit more aware of that could cause some downstream effects. And if your healthcare provider and trusted resource had the ability to be proactive and say, hey, listen, we should do a sleep study or figure out what's going on with like your vitamin levels, that would be a really cool place to live in, a great society.
It would. I think that, and in the meantime, let's also respect and honor the human connection that, we talk about. The family caregiver is the best remote patient monitor there is. The scale, that you put in somebody's home because of a CHF diagnosis is only good if they step on it, right? And yet we talk to people every day who say, we found this and this and this with your mom, and it's like, yeah, I told you that 6 months ago. Or I often use the example of my mother, who, if I knew who her health plan was, or had a way of, or who her physician was, I would call them. I mean, this sounds terrible because I could find this out, but you want to know who's a fall risk? My mother, right? I'm constantly in the why is this rug in this place with nothing tacked down? So, that is something that every health plan talks about. I wish we knew more about fall risk in our population. The caregiver will tell you, right? The family member will tell you exactly what's happening. And I think the issue is, how do you prioritize and create a strategy for reaching that non-technical alarm system or sensory system because we also, in addition to like, how do we better appreciate changes in our own chemistry or sleep patterns or whatever that we can't notice, there are plenty of things that we're all watching with our own two eyes, but nobody's asking us, and we don't know to tell. So I think there's a piece of yes and, right? How do we get better connection of data, but also still listen to what people say, because they're the fastest path to finding out the things that we want to find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this in twofold. And my mind went to a weird place while you were talking there. I was like, RPM devices and AI pale in comparison to the intuition of a caregiver or a loved one. Mm-hmm. Like it's easy to see the patterns subconsciously in what's happening with somebody who you truly love. And that data is incredibly rich for you to be able to leverage to help the life of that individual.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the mission, right, of doing what you guys do, because in a lot of organizations and a lot of industries, we talk about healthcare. It's like, yeah, that's a nice to have, right? And it must feel so good to be able to say, like, we want to enable family members and caregivers with the tools and the education they need to be able to care for their loved ones. Yep. But there has to be money behind this mission as well. In our previous conversation, you said something to me where you were like, there were, I want to say it was two nuns, right, who you might have had an interaction with, where you said no money, no mission, or something like that. What was that?
Yeah. It was a Catholic health system, so in the boardroom they always had the nuns who were on the board of the health system, and they were that's what they would say. It's no money, no mission. They were not kidding around. And maybe that goes back to the thin margins that hospitals have to work under. But yeah, if it's people will be able to tell now that I just steal sayings from other people. I try to credit them. Another one that has served me well over a career of trying to do what I hope is the right thing in healthcare is it's all just interesting cocktail conversation unless it drives a financial outcome, a clinical outcome, or meets a regulatory requirement. So I have somehow found myself in a couple decades of work in patient engagement and now family caregiver engagement, which can easily slide into interesting cocktail conversation unless you're measuring something out of it. And so I think, and maybe the lesson for any any business, which sounds so basic, but if you can't figure out how the money flows for your customer and how you can help that, you're in trouble. And so, as good as whatever your selling is. So for us, it's very easy to feel, or to on a cursory level say it's a nice to have. But the fact it goes back to your, one of your first questions about what is a hidden workforce, why a hidden workforce. And, we have what I would, there are sort of like, what are the easy nice to haves of a really satisfying, enriching experience that fits into cocktail conversation, right? That there are all sorts of reasons why organizations care about that, but I think that's a nice to have. What becomes more of a need to have is maybe back to the discussion about remote patient monitoring, or the caregiver as the remote patient monitor. We are constantly interacting with people on behalf of a health plan's member or a health system's patient, where from a risk adjustment perspective, from what the health plan understands that patient or that member's health to be, they think they're healthy, but they have a family caregiver who is working really hard on their behalf. Easy indication that there is something wrong. And we're collecting diagnostic information that would say, these are all the reasons why they are probably not healthy. And from a risk adjustment perspective, they need an assessment, or we need to get them into primary care for a better coding. or for coding them up. Now, there's a lot of attention and risk adjustment and fraud and abuse, and I'm not trying to wade too far into that topic today, but you can start to see very quickly how you have a caregiver who's in crisis or at least in need for a reason, and it is an indicator of the health and wellness of a member or a patient, and that's where the intervention needs to happen. If you think about serious illness, most people, going back to your dad's example, most people have never heard of palliative care. And so, or think if they've heard of it, they think it's hospice or that it's, quote unquote, pulling the plug. Well, supportive care can be a really cost-effective, higher quality of life solution where appropriate. Education of the family, the family caregiver is often the obstacle to getting that in place. And so there are really specific scenarios where I think healthcare organizations could think differently about what role the family caregiver is playing, how hidden they are, and how much they need them to they need to bring them out of those shadows, because they're the key care partner. And so that's the quest we're on, is let's identify those paths where it's not just a nice to have, we're going to do something as a member satisfier. You're going to get the member satisfaction. That halo effect is going to come. But the real reason is because, if a caregiver is exhausted or depressed, the likelihood that their loved one is going to the ED more than they need to is pretty high, 75% higher, right? So these are things that I think getting recognition that the caregiver is a therapeutic agent is and more than just it's nice to have family around is really the move from the shift from nice to have to a real recognition of centrality for the family caregiver.
Well, I mean, it's so easy to understand why so much of your heart and hustle, right, is behind this mission and what you guys are doing at Carallel. I literally cannot thank you enough for spending so much of your such valuable time and your energy, right, trying to advocate for the people who truly need the support. And it's not just the patient, but it's everybody else who surrounds them, right, who creates the outcomes. So as part of our tradition here on the podcast, our previous guest wants to ask you a blind question. All right.
This is the thing that I was most worried about on this.
So this is your question. All right. So how do you create legacy, not for yourself, but for those who you want to be successful behind you, so they can lead in a sustainable and more impactful way? Think about this like your kids.
How do I think about legacy? I think that weirdly, so I'm gonna draw a weird parallel. You talked about the pit. Somebody just turned me on to Alone. Have you ever watched Alone?
Yeah.
Where they drop somebody in a bunch of people in the wilderness? And one of the things that I was, as you were saying that just struck me, is most of the dialogue. So for people who don't know what this is, people are dropped into the wilderness, almost no resources, and the only communication they can have with the outside world is to say, I want to go home. So they're out there for weeks at a time, and they're talking on recordings that they're making. So it's really like an inner dialogue that you're listening to, and the inner dialogue is often about family and parents and legacy and what gets passed down, and all of the lessons seem to be by example. It's rarely, this person would tell me this or directly instructed me that. It was more about, I watched them do X, Y, or Z. And so I think, I'm not really constituted as a person who thinks that I'm trying, like, I have any business teaching anybody anything. But I think that you never know who you influence. And I've gotten to a point where I'm old enough that people who have surprised me have said, well, you did this and it meant something to me, and positive and negative, by the way. And so I think, for my kid and for thinking about legacy, I guess it's about doing the right thing when it's the hard thing. There are plenty of times we get decisions to make where, it would be a lot easier to keep it to yourself or not disclose or whatever the case might be. And that's the time to do the right thing. And I think just try to keep the hustle, the energy and when you get punched in the neck just to keep going is the thing that I think a lot of people I've found respond to. So I'm going to keep trying to tell that tale.
Well, I can't thank you enough, seriously, for coming on the podcast. Once again, easy to understand why you're the definition of Heart and Hustle with your experience and working in health technology and innovation and what you guys are doing at Carallel now. It's so cool to be able to, be here with you right now, because I know the future is bright, and I can't wait to have you back on the episode for another time. But seriously, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Really fun, Keenan. And I appreciate the way that you're bringing these conversations to light, because it's inspiring to listen to the other sessions. And so thank you.
Absolutely, guys. We'll catch you in the next one. That's the pod.